The Vorkai stripped his humanity down to the wire. He used the wire to kill them. The power died across Sector 9 at 03:47 hours, and Kale Marin died with it. Not permanently. Not the way his squad mates had died in the Ridge ambush 3 hours prior, their bodies cooling in the amber dust of Verdania's third continent, blood soaking into soil that hadn't seen rain in 6 weeks because the Vorkai, atmospheric processors had been running non-stop for 11 months. He died the way machines die, mid-sentence, mid-breath, mid-thought. One moment he was running a diagnostic on his left arm actuator, and the next moment there was nothing. No pain, no darkness. Just an absence so complete it had no edges. He came back on the pulse. The electromagnetic detonation the Vorkai fired at the Colonial Relay, station 3 kilometers east, was meant to cripple human communications across the entire settlement grid. It did that. It also, incidentally, sent a 40 millikiloton surge of raw, unregulated power screaming through every conductor within 2 kilometers, including the emergency neural bridge, threaded through what remained of Kale Marin's cerebral cortex. He woke up on the floor of a collapsed maintenance corridor with dirt in his mouth, and a sound like cathedral bells dying slowly in his skull. His visual feeds came online in fragments. Thermal first, then standard spectrum, then the layered tactical overlay that his handler, Corporal Essa Vane, had always called the wallpaper no one asked for. His chronometer was wrong by 4 minutes. His location transponder was broadcasting his position to a receiver that no longer existed. He lay still for a long time. The arm was the first thing he cataloged. His left arm from the elbow down was not biological. It hadn't been for 3 years, not since the skirmish at Belmore Station, where a Vorkai spine cutter had removed it, with the casual efficiency of something that didn't understand why the gesture should mean anything. The prosthetic was a Helix 7 combat variant, matte black, articulated to within 4 degrees of organic dexterity. It worked. He flexed it in the dark and listened to the faint hydraulic sigh and thought, "Tch, one thing working." His right hand was biological. He pressed it flat against the dirt floor and pushed himself upright. Corridor resolved around him, buckled support struts. A chunk of ceiling that had come down at an angle and turned itself into an accidental leak. Emergency lighting. One strip, amber, flickering at the far end, painting everything the color of old bruises. Somewhere above him, 2 meters of rubble and collapsed flooring. The battle for Verdania Colony Settlement 7 was either being won or being lost. He didn't know which yet. He found his rifle under a broken coolant pipe. The barrel was bent 3 degrees off true. He straightened it against the edge of the strut, with a sound like a question, being answered wrong, tested the sight picture, decided it would have to do. His ammunition counter read 41 rounds. His sidearm was still holstered, undamaged. He had 4 field rations, 2 water packs, 1 trauma kit with a depleted coagulant charge, and a small photograph tucked into the inside pocket of his chest rig. His daughter Mira, at age 6, squinting into the sun outside the settlement's greenhouse dome, holding up a tomato like she'd won a prize. He put his hand over that pocket once briefly. Then he began to move. Verdania had been a farming world. That was the thing the tactical briefings never quite captured. Or if they did, they buried it under logistics and threat assessments, and the particular cold language of military necessity. Verdania had been a farming world, teen settlement clusters across 3 continents, 60,000 colonists, an agricultural output that fed 4 planetary systems. The soil was remarkable. Rainfall patterns were reliable. The colonists had spent 40 years making something out of nothing, pulling green life from a planet that had previously offered only dust and rock and a breathable atmosphere that barely cleared the threshold. The Vorkai had arrived 11 months ago and begun converting it, not conquering. Converting. There was a difference, and the difference mattered to Kale in a way he struggled to articulate to people who hadn't seen it firsthand. Conquest implied a transfer of control. What the Vorkai were doing was more absolute. They were remaking the planet's surface, according to a logic that had nothing to do with human needs or human history or the 40 years of labor that had made those fields possible. The atmospheric processors were first. 9 massive installations that altered precipitation patterns, cooled temperatures, reduced the particular wavelength of sunlight that Earth-strain crops required. The soil reclamation arrays followed, threading harvester roots 3 meters deep, pulling mineral compounds from the ground, in a way that left the topsoil gray and dead. The greenhouse domes, the ones the colonists had built, the ones like the one in Mira's photograph, had been disassembled and repurposed, their polymer panels used to construct Vorkai relay nodes. The planet was being hollowed out, not for conquest, for processing. This was what Kale had been told. This was what the intelligence reports said. He had read those reports, internalized them, repeated them to his squad as context, as justification, as the reason why they were here and why the work mattered. He had not fully understood it until he climbed out of the rubble and stood on the surface of Sector 9 and saw the fields. Or rather, saw what was left of the fields. Row upon row of gray nothing, the soil cracked and alkaline, the remains of grain stalks standing like burnt matches. In the middle distance, the lights of a Vorkai processing installation blinked slow and blue, indifferent as stars. And at the far edge of his vision, barely visible against the pre-dawn sky, a single line of green, a tree line, the remains of a windbreak that the farmers had planted 3 decades ago. Still somehow alive, still holding. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he pulled up his tactical overlay and started figuring out how to survive the next 6 hours. The Vorkai did not think of themselves as conquerors either. This was something Kale had pieced together from intelligence intercepts, captured equipment from the handful of human xenobiologists who had actually studied the species before the war, made academic study a luxury no one could afford. The Vorkai thought of Thelsums as optimizers. They had a concept. The intercept translators rendered it as something between perfection and completion that governed their approach to any world they encountered. A world in its natural state was, to Vorkai thinking, finished, incomplete. The presence of biological complexity, ecosystems, evolved life, the messy, inefficient tangle of organisms depending on organisms, was evidence of a problem not yet solved. Their function, as they understood it, was to solve it. They had been doing this for a long time. Verdania was not their first world. The conversion process had a specific shape, the atmosphere, then the soil, then the biological entities. The colonists had initially been left alone, not out of mercy but out of something closer to assessment. The Vorkai were studying them, categorizing, deciding what role, if any, human biological systems could play in the optimized final state of the world. The war had started when a junior Vorkai field commander had reached a conclusion and begun acting on it. Without waiting for authorization, humans were convertible. Their neural architecture, stripped of its emotional and social components, was efficient enough to be useful. Their bodies could be adapted. The process was not gentle, but it was effective. 43 colonists from Settlement 12 had been the first to go through it. After that, the diplomacy failed. Kale found Sergeant Hessa Drummond at 0600, in the ruins of a water reclamation facility 300 meters from his emergence point. She was alive, barely, with a Vorkai resonance burn along her left side that had fused 2 of her ribs and was making breathing and exercise in controlled agony. He gave her the coagulant charge for the wound on her leg and the trauma kit's last analgesic tab for the ribs, and she took them, without complaint, which told him the pain was worse than she was letting on. She'd been a farmer before the war. Her family had worked the eastern settlements for 2 generations. She'd enlisted 18 months ago, when the Vorkai processing arrays had started. Moving east. How bad is it up top, she asked, meaning the battle. I don't know yet. I've been underground. Relay's gone. I can hear fire to the north, but it's been quiet for about an hour. She paused to breathe carefully. In, hold out. The way you breathe when your ribs are damaged. Either we push them back or they finished. Either way we move. Can you walk? Yes. No hesitation. He respected that. They moved east toward the secondary rally point, keeping to cover, crossing 300 meters of open ground in 4 separate dashes that left Hessa pale and sweating, but still moving. They found Private Oren Kess at the rally point. 22 years old, born in the colonies, had never seen Earth. Spoke of it the way people speak of mythological places. Crouched behind a collapsed wall with his rifle across his knees, and an expression of exhausted relief when he saw them, 3 of them, out of 11. Kale did the math and did not share it. Comms, he said, spotty. Got through to Vane maybe 20 minutes ago. She's holding the forward observation post with 4 others. Oren pulled up the signal. Static, mostly, but a voice in the static that resolved into Corporal Vane's voice, flat and professional, reporting position and status in the measured tone of someone who was afraid, but had decided that being afraid was not the primary thing at the moment. She said there's something happening at the processing installation. New activity. They're moving colonists. Kale went still. Which colonists? The ones from the settlements in the Middle Valley. There were maybe 400 people still there when we came through 3 weeks ago. Oren's voice was careful, kept deliberately even. She says they're moving them toward the installation, the conversion machines, the same process that had taken the 43 people from Settlement 12. How long have we got? She doesn't know. Vorkai are moving fast. Kale was quiet for a moment. He thought about the tactical situation, the resources they had, the distance to the installation, the number of Vorkai between here and there. He thought about his daughter's photograph. He thought about the tree line he'd seen from the rubble, still green, still holding. Then we move fast too, he said. They found Essa Vane at 0720. She was smallman with a very large presence, the kind of officer who could fill a room by being quiet in it. Stillness communicated more than most people's shouting. She'd been Kale's handler for 2 years before the tactical situation made handler a term, and they'd become more simply the 2 senior people left in a situation that kept running out of people. She had a habit of tilting her head slightly to the left when she was working through a problem, and she was doing it now, studying the topographical display she'd pulled up on a handheld projector, the installation's layout rendered in pale blue light that turned everyone's faces the color of ice. 9, she said when he came in, meaning how many of them were left, meaning she'd already done the count. 9, he confirmed. She nodded once, the way you nod when the answer is what you expected, and you'd been hoping to be wrong. Here's what I know. The installation runs 3 conversion nodes. They've been operating at partial capacity. I think they're calibrating. Or maybe they're waiting for a critical mass of subjects before they run a full cycle. The colonists from the valley settlements are in a holding area on the eastern side of the installation. There. She indicated 2 points on the display, probably 5 to 8 hours before they start the process. Guards? Heavy exterior. Lighter inside. The interior is mostly automated. The Vorkai don't post soldiers where machines can do the work. She looked up from the display. The conversion process itself runs on a central control architecture. 1 command node. Shut it down and the whole thing stops. Where's the command node? Inside the primary processing chamber, center of the installation. Directly adjacent to the conversion terminals where they're holding the colonists. She let that sit. I don't have a good solution here, Kale. I want to be honest about that. 9 people against a hardened Vorkai installation. It's not a favorable calculation. He thought about the 43 people from Settlement 12. He thought about 400 more. Show me the approach vectors, he said. There was a moment, around 0900, while they were threading through the ruins of the eastern settlement quarter toward the installation perimeter, when Kel and Essa walked in silence for a stretch, and he found himself telling her about Mira. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because the odds were the odds and there wasn't much point in not saying things. Maybe because Essa had met Mira once, at a logistics depot on the colony's western end, before the war had gotten serious, and had given her a piece of candy from her ration kit and called her terrifyingly opinionated for a 6-year-old, which had been accurate and had made Mira laugh. She would have been 7 last month, he said. She's on the evacuation ships. She made it out. I know, Essa said. You told me 3 times. Yeah, it's fine. A pause. Keep telling me. It means you're thinking about something worth surviving for. They moved through a gap in a collapsed wall, single file. On the other side, the installation rose against the lightening sky. Massive and functional, built with the Vorkai's characteristic contempt for aesthetics and excellence at purpose. It looked like a machine designed by something that had never needed to consider how a thing would feel to look at. Which it was. If something happens to me, Kale said, nothing's going to happen to you. If it does, then I'll tell Mira her father died annoying me right up to the end, Essa said. Which she'll believe, Because she's met you. She did not look at him when she said it. She kept her eyes on the installation. But there was something in the angle of her jaw, particular set of her mouth, that was its own kind of declaration. He didn't say anything else. Neither did she. They reached the perimeter. The breach took 11 minutes and 2 casualties they hadn't been able to avoid. Private Kess was fine. Hesse Drummond's ribs made the infiltration harder than it should have been, but she made it through without complaint, which continued to be an act of considerable heroism that no one was in a position to formally acknowledge. The 2 casualties were both from Esse's fire team. Both were alive, and both were in a position to cover their extraction point. Cale made himself do the accounting and then made himself stop doing it, because the accounting wasn't helping anyone. Inside, the installation was exactly what the intelligence said it would be. Lighter on guards, heavier on machines. The machines were Vorkai standard, multi-limbed drones, angular and efficient, built around a sensory architecture that perceived heat and motion and chemical composition and not much else. Humans moved differently than Vorkai. The drone's behavioral algorithms were calibrated for Vorkai movement patterns. It wasn't much of an edge, but it was an edge. They used it. The holding area was on the eastern side, as Esse's display had shown. The colonists, Cale counted quickly, came up with 370, allowed for a margin of error, were being kept in an open staging space bounded by field emitters that would incapacitate anyone who crossed them, weren't lethal. The Vorkai's efficiency again. Damaged subjects were less useful for conversion. The colonists were frightened, many of them, not injured. Some of them were very quiet. Some of them were holding each other. A woman near the backs was humming something Cale didn't recognize. Low and rhythmic, the kind of sound you make to remind yourself you're still there. He filed that sound away without knowing why. Hesse took position at the emitter control junction. She'd been a farm equipment mechanic before she was a soldier, and Vorka field emitters used a power regulation architecture that was not so different in its fundamental logic from the systems she'd spent years maintaining. She said quietly that she could collapse the field boundary in about 4 minutes if nothing interrupted her. Cale looked at Essa. Essa looked at the primary processing chamber. "The command node is in there," she said. "I know. It'll be guarded. Than the rest of the facility. I know that too. If we shut it down wrong, if we trigger an emergency protocol, the conversion sequence might run autonomously on whatever subjects are already in the system." Which subjects are in the system? She checked her scanner. Her face did something he'd seen it do before. A small tightening around the eyes, particular expression of someone receiving information they'd hoped was wrong. They've already started the process on some of the colonists. Lee stage. Not complete. If we crash the system cold, it could. She didn't finish the sentence. What does it need to stop cleanly? Controlled shutdown command. Through the primary interface. She brought up the installation's architecture on her handheld. Here, the interface is physical. Mechanical override, Vorkai standard. But it's positioned in the chamber. A pause. Deep in the chamber. He studied the schematic. The chamber was large. The interface was at its far end. Between the entrance and the interface were the conversion terminals, and the architecture of the space, the way the processing systems were arranged, meant that anything moving through it would be tracked by the installation's internal sensor net. Can you spoof the sensor net? Partially. Long enough to get someone through the first half of the chamber, maybe. She tilted her head slightly to the left, thinking. After that, someone's going to have to be creative. Cale looked at his left arm, the matte black Helix 7, its articulated finger and its hydraulic whisper and its 4 degrees of organic dexterity precision. He flexed it once. "I'm going in," he said. The chamber was louder than he'd expected. The conversion systems made a sound, a low, sustained harmonic that you felt in your back teeth rather than heard with your ears. The resonance of massive machines working at the edge of their tolerance. The air tasted of ozone and something else, something metallic and almost organic, that he didn't have a category for and chose not to think about too carefully. The terminals were active. 8 of them in 2 rows, each housing a colonist in an early-stage conversion sequence. He walked past them. He didn't look. Then he did look, Because not looking was a choice to not know. And he'd decided years ago that not knowing was the more dangerous option. They were alive. Whatever the conversion did in its early stages, it didn't look like injury. It looked more like sleep, or a very deep concentration, as if each person was intensely focused on a thought they couldn't share. He recognized one of them, a man named Torben, who had run the Eastern Settlement Seed Library, who had spent 30 years collecting and preserving the agricultural varieties that the Vorkai's soil reclamation arrays had been destroying. He had a daughter, Kale thought, or maybe a son, he couldn't remember. He kept moving. Essa's spoofing held through the first 40 meters. Then a drone tracked him. Not his heat signature, which she'd managed to mask, his prosthetic arm, which was broadcasting low-level EM noise that the drone's architecture flagged as anomalous. It moved toward him from the right. He shot it with his sidearm suppressed, and the shot was quiet enough that nothing else triggered. The shot was logged. Somewhere in the installation's network, a flag had been raised. He moved faster. The command interface was where the schematics said it would be. At the far end of the chamber, recessed into the wall, physical console with Vorkai tactile controls and a primary override mechanism that looked, to Kale's admittedly non-expert eye, like a large mechanical switch positioned roughly 8 centimeters above what his arm could comfortably reach. He stood in front of it and took stock. He was 2 meters short of the override's reach. The console's lower controls, the ones he could access, were input terminals for the shutdown command sequence. The sequence required a physical confirmation at the override before it would execute. The Vorkai built this kind of redundancy into everything. System critical action without physical verification. He respected the design philosophy even as he wanted, intensely, find the engineer who'd implemented it and have a conversation about proportionality. He stretched. His biological arm, his right arm, close but not close enough. His prosthetic could extend further, but the Helix 7's range of motion topped out 40 millimeters below the override. S position. He could see the switch. He could not reach it. He stood in the humming chamber and thought. The thinking took approximately 4 seconds, or 4.5 seconds longer than it felt like. He thought about what he'd told his squad 2 years ago, when they were greener and scared and trying to make sense of the Vorkai. They're optimizers. They believe in solving problems. They see anything inefficient as a problem to be fixed. That's their framework, and it's a powerful one. But it's also a limitation. They only know how to solve problems they've seen before. He thought about lying. Not the way people usually thought about lying. He'd spent 2 years telling tactical lies, misdirection, false positioning, information manipulation, and he'd gotten good at it. But this was different. This was a different kind of lie. The kind that didn't deceive an enemy. The kind that deceived a system. He pulled up his own tactical overlay. He accessed the Helix 7's diagnostic interface. He found the parameter he was looking for. The actuator extension limit, the physical constraint that kept the arm from overextending and causing structural damage to its own architecture. There was a reason for that limit. The arm's designers had installed it as a safety feature. Good engineering, responsible engineering. He disabled it. He had approximately 40 seconds before the compromised diagnostic flag propagated to the arm's safety interrupt, and the failsafe triggered an emergency lockdown. He didn't need 40 seconds. He needed about 3. He reached up. The arm extended past its design limit. He could hear the actuators straining, a sound that was mechanical, objectively mechanical, and that he still found unpleasant in a way he couldn't entirely account for. The servos in his shoulder complained. The structural integrity warning appeared in his overlay in bright red, which he ignored. The arm extended, and the fingers of his prosthetic hand, articulated to within 4 degrees of organic dexterity, touched the surface of the override. He applied pressure. The switch moved. The chamber's harmonic shifted, dropping in pitch, then dying. The conversion terminals went dark. The 8 colonists in the terminal housings exhaled simultaneously, or at least it seemed that way, and he heard that sound. The collective return of people to themselves, and thought of the woman who'd been humming in the holding area. The failsafe triggered. The arm locked at full extension, rigid, useless. pointing at the now deactivated override like an accusation. He'd fix that later. He'd deal with the structural repair, the actuator recalibration, the technical consequences of what he'd just done to the arm's integrity. He'd deal with all of it later. The important thing was that the chamber was quiet. He found Essa outside the chamber entrance, where she wasn't supposed to be. "I heard the shutdown complete," she said. "And then I heard you weren't coming out." I got slowed down. He held up the locked arm. The override was positioned for Vorkai reach. She looked at the arm, at him, at the arm again. "This'll beast limit." Briefly. "The arm is currently pointing at my head." Also briefly. He worked the manual override on the elbow joint with his right hand, and the arm folded down to a resting position, rigid and semi-functional. He'd assess the full damage later. "Hessa? The field emitters are down. The colonists are out of the holding area. Kess is getting them organized." Pause. It worked. He noticed she said it as if she hadn't been certain it would, which was honest in a way he appreciated. "How many Vorkai response units on the way?" "Too many to fight directly." She pulled up her tactical display. "Got a window. Maybe 20 minutes before the installation's backup sensors get a lock and relay our position. Then we use 20 minutes. They moved." The extraction was the part that could be written up as a textbook example of improvised asymmetric withdrawal, and probably would be, by people who hadn't been there and so could afford to find it elegant. For Kale, it was 22 minutes of controlled chaos, 364 civilians, and 9 soldiers moving through Vorkai-occupied terrain toward the extraction zone, using the time that the installation's sensor blackout bought them, before the Vorkai response forces reorganized. Hessa led the colonists' movement, despite her ribs, because she knew the terrain, and because she was the kind of person who stood from the front, regardless of personal cost. Private Kess turned out to be an excellent rearguard, which he attributed to having grown up on a settlement that required a lot of creative negotiation with wildlife, and which Kale chose to accept as an explanation. Essa coordinated the route in real time, redirecting twice, when Vorkai scout units crossed their path, finding the gaps in the sensor coverage with the particular skill of someone who had spent 2 years learning how the enemy thought. The installation went up behind them at the 15-minute mark, not because of anything they'd done, or not directly. The controlled shutdown KL had initiated had included a cascade that, when the installation's emergency protocols attempted to restart the conversion systems without a physical confirmation command, caused a power regulation failure that the Vorkai had not apparently planned for. The engineering failure worked its way through the installation's infrastructure for about 12 minutes before it found something critical. When it did, it found it all at once. The explosion was visible from the extraction zone, a column of blue-white light very bright, then gone. Then the sound, arriving a few seconds later like news does. Some of the colonists stopped and looked. A woman near the back of the group was still humming. He recognized the tune now, something old, something he associated with a specific quality of morning light and a meal he couldn't name and a person he couldn't quite picture. Kind of melody that lived in the part of the brain that stores things without asking permission. She kept humming it through the explosion and through the moment after, and through the beginning of the walk to the extraction zone, and nobody told her to stop. The extraction ships arrived at 1100. They were small, fast military utility transports, and they had been waiting in low orbit for 2 hours, which suggested that whoever had authorized their pre-positioning had held a better opinion of the mission's chances than Kale had. He chose to feel grateful for that rather than offended. He stood at the loading ramp and counted people as they boarded. 1, 2, 3, 4, watching the faces come up the ramp, watching for the particular expression that survivors carry when they don't quite believe it yet. Essa stood beside him. She had a cut on her cheek that she hadn't mentioned, and that she was clearly trying to prevent him from seeing, by keeping it on the side away from him, which wasn't working. "You've got blood on your face," he said. "I'm aware. You should have." "I was busy," she paused. "How's the arm?" "Locked at the elbow. Functional at the wrist and hand. I'll need a full actuator replacement when we get back to the forward base." "That sounds expensive." It was worth it. She was quiet for a moment. Around them, people moved. 364 of them, loading, boarding, beginning the process of surviving. Torben, the seed librarian, went up the ramp with the careful steps of someone who was still relearning how to inhabit himself, who still had the slightly distant look of someone arriving back from a long way away. He paused at the top of the ramp and looked back across the landscape. The dead fields, the burning installation, the tree line that was still, probably, green. And then he went inside. The colonists from Settlement 12, Kale said.
The first 43.
There are teams looking, Essa said. The installation that processed them was in the northern sector. It's still standing. There are access to those systems now. The process is reversible. The xenobiologists think it is. Partially. It depends on how far through the sequence they were. She chose her words carefully, as she always did when the truth needed to be handled with precision. It's not certain, but it's not nothing. He nodded. He thought about reversibility, about what it meant for a process to run backward. Throughs, about the 43 people who had gone through something that no one had asked them to go through, and what it would take to undo it. He thought about the conversion terminal where Torben had been, and the look on Torben's face now, which was not quite right yet, but was becoming more itself by the minute. The Vorkai were optimizers. They believed in solving problems. They saw anything incomplete as a failure state to be corrected. Humans were different. Humans lived in the incomplete. They built homes in it, food in it, raised children in it, hummed tunes in it, while standing in holding areas surrounded by alien field emitters. They were messier than the Vorkai. Noisier. Less efficient. They made decisions based on photographs and half-remembered melodies and the specific weight of an arm that no longer worked right. They disabled safety limits and jammed mechanical switches and extracted 400 people from hardened military installations with 9 personnel and improvisation and an absolutely irrational belief that it was possible. The Vorkai had been optimizing worlds for a very long time. They'd never met anything like this. Kale went up the ramp last. 3 weeks later, he was sitting in a repair bay on Forward Base Heron while a technician worked on the Helix 7 arm, replacing the actuators, calibrating the extension parameters, rebuilding the structural components he'd pushed past their tolerances. When Essa came in with a message, the colonists from Settlement 12, the first 43, the xenobiologists had accessed the northern installation's systems and run the reversal protocols. It had worked for 38 of them. Not completely. There were cognitive effects, adjustment periods, things that would take months or years to fully resolve. But the core of them, the essential self that made each of them who they were, had come back, 38 out of 43. Not perfect, not clean, not the kind of outcome that fit neatly into a report human. He read the message twice. The technician kept working on his arm. Outside the bay, through a narrow window, he could see a section of Verdania's sky, the wrong color, still from the atmospheric processors, too pale, too cool, but in the near distance, through the base's perimeter, there was a greenhouse dome. A temporary one, civilian-built, thrown up fast from salvaged materials by some of the returned colonists who had apparently decided that the first thing to do after surviving was to start growing things again. He could see the green shadow of plants through the dome's translucent walls. He put his hand, his right hand, the biological one, in his chest rig pocket, felt the photograph, Mira at 6 holding the tomato, squinting into the sun. He thought, I'll tell her. Someday, I'll tell her all of it. The technician finished the left actuator and moved to the wrist assembly. The arm was coming back online in sections, the diagnostic light cycling from red to amber to green. The arm, which had been locked and half-functional and structurally compromised, was becoming itself again. Outside, the greenhouse dome held its green. He decided he wasn't done yet.